Football clubs are full of stories. Tales of greatness and of triumph, of joy and sometimes heartbreak. But there are stories and then there are legends. Thanks to McCafe, we will talk to some of the Geelong Football Club's greatest players and hear some of their greatest stories. Welcome to Legends of Kardinia Park. Welcome to the Legends of Kardinia Park, proudly brought to you by McCafe. It's an exciting new members exclusive experience where we're going to talk to some of the true greats of this wonderful football club, the Geelong Football Club, and I'm lucky enough to be joined by one of those men today, Mick Turner. Mick, thank you so much for coming along.
Geelong using three ruck rovers as Clark now gets it to Turner. Turner using his pace. He's well shepherded there by Lund. Runs around another tackle. Turner goes goal. It's across the face maybe. It's a beautiful goal.
Free kick to go. He immediately transfers it over to Turner. Turner once again coming down towards the goals and with a beautiful long kick. It's close. That's good.
It is Tim Darcy from half forward back infield towards Turner, who will run around, does well too, Turner, and fire towards goal, and I think it's there. It is another great goal.
Anticipating beautifully and puts it back into the forward pocket. Up is Tui, taken here by Turner. Turner into the full forward zone. It's a great shot.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. Thanks for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. 240 games for the Cats, a captain of the club, team of the century wingman. On the other side to your dad, which must be really, really special. I want to get to that in just a second. All Australian, leading goal kicker, a massive list of accolades, and that's not to mention the impact that you've had on a future generation of footballers in your role at the Geelong Falcons, which I'm also keen to talk to you about. But can I go all the way back, if you don't mind, Mick, to the boy that grew up in Warrnambool, dad having played for the Cats? Was it always the dream to wear the blue and white hoops?
Yeah, I think it was back in the day. I was born in Geelong at Baxter House. Dad was playing for Geelong, and in those days, Cam, Geelong had a lot of success. They won the 51-52 premiership. They went for 26 games undefeated, and probably should have won in 53 when Collingwood beat them, and that was a little bit disappointing. But in those days, players tended not to stay like we did and had really long careers. I think Dad said to me at the time, players were being paid about £3 a game. Reg Hickey was on 10, but the money was in the country, so a lot of the really good players would go back to the country or interstate. He went to Warrnambool, where he went from £3 a game to £30 a game, which is a massive amount of money to coach Warrnambool and coach them to a premiership. I can actually remember Bobby Davis during his reign coming down to talk to Dad about coming back to Geelong to coach Geelong and about the Peter Pianto era. But Dad had set up by then a really good business and was doing well in Warrnambool and decided to stay there. So the money had an influence, but it was around business and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, look, I grew up as any kid in Warrnambool with a father that played for Geelong, and the dream was to always play, but the matter was whether you were good enough.
Were you super quick as a kid? Because we've now watched some highlights of you and seen you running up and down on the wing at Kardinia Park, lightning fast. Were you always that fast?
I was always a really good athlete when I was going to St Joseph's in Warrnambool. I know you went to Joey's in Geelong, but no, I was a good athlete. Pre-puberty, won the hurdles and the sprints and ran in the athletics in Melbourne at Landy Field it was in those days. So yeah, I was a good athlete and I was a good footballer. I had an interesting stage. I went to boarding school for 3 years at Monterey in Hamilton, which was a pretty strict Catholic boarding school. And during that time, I was very late going through puberty, as my own sons were, and my athleticism and my football ability dropped off a bit because I wasn't maturing like the other boys were. And actually in year 11, I didn't play football at all. I broke my collarbone at the start of the year, but I was about 5'1" and far too small to play. So didn't play. So at that time, I didn't really think that I would have the ability to play AFL football or even get to Geelong. But then I made a decision to leave boarding school. It was pretty hard work at boarding school during the 60s. It was hard work, big dormitories, a lot of boys, a lot of bullying. The priests and brothers were great, but the kids were pretty hard to handle. So I made a decision to come back to St Joseph's in Warrnambool, and then all of a sudden I just started to grow. I started to go through puberty stage. Started at CBC, which is St Joseph's under-17 side, and played my first game. I remember the second game, a player came back from injury and I was on the bench. And I can still remember clearly sitting on the bench and saying, look, this is not going to happen. The dream's never going to happen. I'm going to have to do something else. And but look, got back on the field again, grew a lot that year, and ended up winning the St Joseph's Under-17s Best and Fairest Award. So that projected into playing for Warrnambool the next year, and that was in the Handon Football League in the Under-18s, and kept maturing. So that year won the Judd Cup, which was the best and fairest for the league. And then at that time, Geelong started to take a bit of notice.
So sorry to jump in. Who was that at Geelong? Who was the recruiting manager, coaching? Who was starting to look at you then?
Well, I think Bill McMaster probably doesn't get the credit he deserves, but he had a really good network of people working for him. So people came down and watched me play. It was hearsay in those days because no games were filmed. It was people saying that you better come and have a look at Leo Turner's son Michael. He's starting to show a bit of form, and people would come down and watch you play, particularly during the finals in those years. But Bill did a really good job. He had a good recruiting network in Geelong, and they started to work their zone really well, which was up in the Murray region then, and brought a lot of players down. So anyhow, won the Judd Cup, came down, did a pre-season for Geelong, but look, I was still very light. I was about 60 kilos. Played the practice games, really couldn't compete with the more mature players, and it was decided that I'd go back to Warrnambool for a year and mature for a while. So I worked for Dad that year. Played Warrnambool seniors that were coached by Terry Alexander, who played a bit of football at Collingwood as a ruckman, and had a really good year again. Won the club best and fairest, the local radio 3YB player of the year, and I think I was runner-up in the Maskell medal, which was the league best and fairest. And as you know, I'm like Cameron, I probably should have won it, but beaten by a bloke called Dan Harrington, who went on to play for Fitzroy. But look, things worked out pretty well for me, and it just sort of happened over a 2 to 3 year period. So I'm sure when I arrived at Geelong, the people I went to school at Monterey would be saying, that couldn't be the same Michael Turner that was at Monterey, it's got to be someone different. But it was just a late maturity thing. I didn't get to mature till I was, and go through puberty till I was 16 or 17. And that was something that sort of stuck with me for the rest of my life, particularly when I was at the Falcons with players like you, that you had to let players get through that period of maturity, because before that there was a great unevenness with players' physical ability. So the rest is history. Came down here in 1974 and was lucky enough to play for 15 years.
A very different looking ground back then. The old Brownlow stand, the standing room on the Mirabel Street wing, completely different. The old Hickey stand was behind the goals. Do you have any memories of that first game, the first time you wore the blue and white hoops? Yeah, look, I thought my form was pretty good during pre-season, and Graham Farmer was the coach, but again, I was pretty light. I was 63 kilos. So I played the first 3 games in the reserves in those days, and then I got an opportunity. I was picked on the bench, and you've got to remember on the bench those days, if you're 19th, 20th man, you sort of came on at the end of the game. You sat there, didn't you?
Sat there for the whole game, unless someone was really badly injured. Was picked on the bench, and then Kenny Newlands, who was also another Warrnambool boy, he pulled out. And I was lucky enough to get picked in the side. So look, I can remember it. I've got a really good long-term memory for that stuff. I remember staying at my grandparents' place where I boarded, just up in Sharp Street across the road here, heading towards Packington, and walked to the game with my mum. Came in, we didn't wear uniforms or anything in those days. It was pretty casual clothes. But, it was a big game. We were playing St Kilda. I was picked to play on the wing. I was on Stewie Trott, who was a state winger at that time. Pretty good player. And look, I did have a really good game. It was wet conditions. Like the grounds never looked like they do now. It was wet. You had centre wicket areas that were muddy. Didn't like going into that muddy area too much. I'd rather sort of stay a little bit wider. But had a good game on Stewie Trott. Was voted best player that day. And I remember coming back to the social club, and no one knew who you were because there was no social media or much media content in those days. And they put me on a plastic table and sort of introduced me to the crowd in the social club and said, this is Leo Turner's son, Michael, who's just played today on the wing, and we've voted him best player. And it sort of went from there. So it was a bit of a meteoric rise. And look, things were different. We didn't have the grandstands like they have now or the facilities, but it was what it was. And you're talking about 50 years ago, but the club was, from my memory, pretty professionally run. The grandstands are old, but they were packed. People used to come to the outer. There was still 35,000 people come to the game, but you've got to remember in those days they weren't seated in luxury; they were all standing. Yep. And the other interesting thing is they played the reserves beforehand. The seniors played afterwards. Don't take this the wrong way, but everyone came along and they brought their own cans. They were all heavy. They were all drinking. They were pretty inebriated by the time the seniors started. And they were in full voice, so it was sort of not sitting there clapping politely that, Cameron's kicked a nice goal on his left foot or anything like that, I actually used to roar. So it was a really energetic atmosphere, and people were really hyped up. So it was just, it's hard to describe. Like 50 years is a long time, but it was, VFL in those times was still AFL, and it was, the best players were still playing, and the atmosphere was fantastic, and it was what it was at the time.
Can I move on to a couple of years, and I want your thoughts on, or memories of them, 1980 and 1981. Yep. It seemed to be, when looking back through your wonderful career, 2 opportunities perhaps to win that elusive premiership. 1980, finish on top of the ladder, lose to Richmond in the second semi-final, and then just lose to Collingwood in that preliminary final. I hate to bring it up, but was that the one that got away?
Well, like you, I mean, everyone plays to play as well as they possibly can, and and that was my mantra in football. If I was picked to play, my job was to play as well as I can. But it's a team game and a team aspect, and I just don't think you get that really strong bond unless you're playing a premiership. You know what it's like playing in your premierships. You get a really strong bond with people. And the thing probably lacking in my career is when you don't get that sort of, things disperse a little bit. But look, we had a good build-up. Graham Farmer was my first coach, and he had a very, very ordinary team that he coached. It's a completely different culture in those days. It was a culture of socialisation and drinking and all that sort of stuff. And then Rod Olsen came along from Hawthorn, and he really did bring a lot of discipline to the club. So he was really good. And then Billy Goggin came along, who was he was the best coach I ever had tactically. He was a very, very good tactical coach, and he was able to take us in 1980 from a side that couldn't make the finals to top of the ladder. Just before the finals in 1980, we played on the MCG. Much like you see now, there was 90,000 people there, and we played Richmond, and we were good against Richmond, particularly at the MCG, and we beat them by about 3 or 4 goals, and we sort of thought going into the finals we'd give ourselves a good chance. So that was unfortunate. But when the finals hit, we played Richmond, from my memory, at Waverley Park. It didn't suit us all that well. They beat us. Woosha Welsh tagged me and did a pretty good job. And then the next week we played Collingwood again at Waverley Park, which didn't suit us again, and we just couldn't quite get over the line. I think we were beaten by 6 or 8 points, something like that. So look, that was really disappointing, because I think if we had got Richmond on the MCG, Stephen Lunn, who played at that time, a good mate of mine, could handle Bartlett. We had a really good back line, centre line. The thing we lacked in those days was a really good functioning forward line. There was too much pressure on Terry Bright to kick the goals, and the other players, look, they were good players, but they weren't a player that's going to win you a premiership. But I'm sure if we had one Gary Ablett or one Barry Stoneham or one Billy Brownless, we would have won the premiership. So 80 was disappointing. 81, the club got pretty proactive, and they knew we needed a full, like a centre half forward, and they got side bottom to come across from St Kilda. That wasn't a great success. I think Billy Goggin went off him a little bit. Brian Peaker, they chased for years and years, came across from East Fremantle, which is legend in its own. And Brian was a great player.
Brought by helicopter, Mick? Do you remember that?
Yes, I was working in Werribee at that time as a teacher, and I remember coming back to training that night in the car, and there was a hell of a lot of people at the ground. There was probably 8,000 to 10,000 people here, and they flew Brian Peaker in a helicopter. And he came on and trained on the ground for about 10 minutes and played that weekend, which is pretty extraordinary. But look, they were proactive, Geelong, and they thought, look, if we get another really good unballer and a forward, we're going to win. We're a chance to win the premiership. So, but lo and behold, I played the first final against Carlton and broke my rib. The next game, the preliminary final, again, Collingwood got us at Waverley. I was going to the hospital that night to get a nerve block put in, which I don't think they'd do these days, so I could play in the grand final, and we would have had another crack to get into it, but it didn't work out, and we got beat in 81 in the preliminary final again, and then lo and behold, we had a pretty ordinary season in 82, and as committees did in those days, Billy Goggin had one bad year and they sacked him as coach, which is quite extraordinary. Reading
back through that seems amazing. You've gone so close in 80, 81, one off season, and all of a sudden a legend of the club's gone.
Yeah, well, I think things were pretty political back in those days, and look, football clubs were run a lot differently. You had your board, your committee running the club, and obviously your coaches and your staff and everything. But I think players in those days probably had too much say. I could handle Billy Goggin because Billy Goggin was a motivator, and he'd quite often do things to motivate you, like drop you or give you a rev in front of the players, and I can handle that sort of stuff. I actually quite like that, but that doesn't work with everyone, as you know, and it doesn't, probably go over these days with younger players. But he got quite a few players offside, and by dropping them or giving them, pretty emotional sprays. I mean, personal sprays. And I think when people were asking questions at the end of his tether in '82, a few of the senior players were sort of complaining about him a little bit, and they sacked Billy and brought in Tommy Hafey. So we levelled off for a few years, and we went from there and like that success.
I want to ask you about round 1, 1984, Mick.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And the centre line that lined up that day. Possibly the greatest centre line ever to line up in AFL, VFL history. Michael Turner on one wing, Greg Williams, Diesel Williams in the middle, and a young Gary Ablett Senior on the other wing. I think in that first game, 88 disposals and 4 goals between the three of you. Against Fitzroy, you destroyed them, which is not surprising given that sort of middle of the ground. What was it like when you knew how to play the wing very, very well, but then you look in the middle and you see Diesel, and on the other side is the great Gary Ablett Senior?
Yeah, well, it was Geelong recruited really well at that time, and Greg Williams couldn't get a look in at Carlton, so they got him down here, and it didn't take too long for me, as I was captain at that time in '84, to realise what a great creative player he was, and that's what you're looking for in a player. He not only made, look, some players go out and play well, but he'd go out and make 18 players play well because of his great attributes with his handball. And I actually convinced Tom Hafey at that time to play him in the middle and put Brian Peake, who was coming, still playing for the club at that time, as ruck rover and forward. So he played him in the middle. And look, it might have been a bit selfish of me also, because I knew I was going to get 18 handballs a game off him. So it certainly helped me.
You've always been very smart, Mick. Yeah, well done.
And it helped Gerard Healy too at the Swans, because I got no doubt he handballed him, even though Gerard was a great player, towards a Brownlow. And Gary was something different. He came to the club, and I still remember talking to Bill McMaster about him. He said, look, this is the best recruit we've ever had at the club. And I said, look, yeah, I've heard all that before. And he was a big, strong man. And in those days, we used to do kick to kick a bit, 2-on-2. Remember 2-on-2 marking, and you have 2 groups of 2, and we kick it backwards and forwards. And look, I rated myself, and I could mark with anyone except a really tall ruckman, key position player and stuff, because they had good spring, and we kicked it back and forwards 20 times. And and I reckon I touched it once in the duels I had with Gary Ablett. And the only time I touched it was when he dropped the ball and it actually went to the ground. And that's not a lie. I remember walking to Tom Hafey just after that exchange and said, look, mate, you're right. This is bloke's, I've never seen anything like this before. Someone not so strong and capable and everything. He wasn't a great trainer at football, but yeah, look, we lined up on the wing, and historically the greatest wing centre line of all time was Richmond's of Francis Burke, Billy Barrett, and who was the other one, Dick Clay. That was always a long-standing centre line, and Richmond had a lot of success in those days. But for a very short period of I think it was only about 5 or 6 games, it was, Turner, Williams and Ablett. And I still remember playing on this wing and looking at the other wing to some of the things he was doing. And he not only destroyed the ball, he destroyed players, like the way he hit them. He's just absolutely... just really, nothing dirty, just the hits and that he had on players, because of his physical strength was unbelievable. And Diesel Williams was probably the most creative player I've ever seen.
I mean, just from my own recollections as an 8-year-old kid, going along to the 1989 final series and probably appreciating Gary Senior for the first time, just how good he was and what he could do with 3 players trying to jump into him, all of that. Is he the greatest you've ever seen? I mean, Lee Matthews, in future generations, Wayne Carey, Gary Jr., Chris Judd. Is Gary Senior the best?
Certainly the most spectacular player. Look, if he had a trained, he would have even been better. He wasn't that keen on training. He used to come out and train and do a bit. We'd do 5K time trials in those days, which I wasn't all that keen on, because I always say to the coaches, we never run 5Ks in a game. And it's that modern thinking, it's speed repeat, just like it is now. Speed repeat, why aren't we training for speed repeat? So in 5K time trials, Gary Ablett would be last, Billy Browns would be second last, and I'd nearly be third last. But when the game came and you were able to play speed repeat football, it was completely different. So, look, as far as Geelong players go, in my career of 15 years, the best players I saw at Geelong was John Newman for a start. And everyone would look at John Newman because of his history at the footy show and say, look, he's an icon, he's a comedian, he's very controversial. But as a player, He was very serious, and he wasn't a big ruckman, but he was a ruckman that was able to play with really debilitating ankle injuries. And he had special tape brought over from him from America, which was moleskin tape that they did their stirrups with, and George Clark used to tape him up. So he played very restricted football in the ruck and centre half forward with very bad ankles, but he was a seriously very, very good player. Greg Williams, as we've mentioned, was the second one, just because he was so creative and just probably one of the biggest politically indecisive decisions ever made to lose him to the Sydney Swans when they didn't have to. David Clark was another great player. David Clark played in sides when Geelong didn't have strong sides, and he was just a superstar, playing on the half forward flank. So he was a great player also. And obviously the last one is Gary Ablett Senior. Played with Gary for about 8 years, sometimes in the centre line, but mostly because of lack of ability to have long endurance, they moved him to the forward line. It would have been interesting to see if he had got a little bit endurance fit and was able to play on the wing a little bit more. But he played a bit at centre half back with Malcolm Blight, but obviously make most of his ability on at the forward line, where he can contest one out or even one or two or three players and beat them. But no, look, he's an extraordinary player. He's just super strong, super agile, super quick. We went to the LA Rams training camp in LA one year in 1980, and look, 100% I could look at Gary Ablett and say he should be a running back for the LA Rams, because he was just explosive, strong, be able to break through the plaques, find the gaps for the field and all that sort of stuff. So he could have been, look, he's obviously a great AFL player. He definitely could have played NFL in my book. He was just perfectly attuned to do that. And at the end of his career, if he wanted to, he could have been a professional boxer, because he could fight. He spent a lot of time in the boxing ring inside, as you know, and he gave Lester Ellis a bit of a touch up at Market Square one day, which didn't go over all that well. Lester was boxing as an exhibition match, and Lester sort of landed one on him, and being Gary Ablett and being quite competitive, he lost it for a little while and gave Lester a hell of a hide, and had to stop the fight. So there's a lot of stories you can tell about Gary, and they continue to form. But no, certainly the most spectacular player I've ever seen. Yep.
The thing about us Australians, everyone's a coffee critic. You give us a lacklustre latte, we'll turn it into a down-the-sink cappuccino. That's why for our 30th birthday, we're celebrating 30 years of early risers, sideline cheers, road trip pick-me-ups, and long sips squeezed into short breaks. Because at McCafe, we're committed to making a smooth, rich blend of coffee, not just fit for anyone, but coffee fit for an Aussie.
You were captain of the club, as I mentioned before. Yep. Talk about that honour, the club that you'd barracked for as a kid, where your dad had played and had such a wonderful career, to then be the captain of the Cats. Yeah,
look, it was good. I was pretty wayward when I was younger, so I'm not going to sit here and say I was the perfect footballer, but it's a different time, Cam. Look, if I was coming through now, as the players are now, you'd be just absolutely, completely professional. You're a full-time player, you've got a manager, you've got so many staff looking after you. You just dedicate yourself to football, because you know if you're going to have a 10-year career, you're going to set yourself up for life. But back in those days, my first game at Geelong was on $40 a game. Towards the end, it got a little bit better. I think I was on 4,000, but it still wasn't massive money. But just a different mindset. So we were pretty, I'm not saying unprofessional, but I would say wayward. There's a lot of drinking, a lot of culture, a lot of mateship and all that sort of stuff. But you'd certainly do things a lot differently now. And so I probably had a reputation when I was a younger bloke of being pretty wild, and I was wild. There's no doubt about that. But they were wild times. There were no iPhones then. And you went out, you partied hard. You'd get into fights, you get into all sorts of mischief. It wouldn't end up in the front or back of the paper because no one was filming it at that time. So you're in a completely different environment now. So, but look, to be made captain of the club was a big thing for me. And I was very honoured to be made captain in '84. Unfortunately, in '85, I did my knee and I couldn't play that year. But sat in the box with Tom Hafey all year and learned a lot about the game, and got back again in '86. It's looking back, and I know it's hard when player and coach don't see eye to eye, and I don't need to get into too much of that if you don't want to. But in 1986, you kicked 50 goals from the wing. 1987, you kicked 49 from the wing. Even in your last year in 1988, you're averaging almost 2.5 goals a game. Like you're playing on the wing with those sorts of averages now, Mick, you'd be going all right. So you still seem to have plenty left in the tank.
were there regrets later on that you could have played more, or is there a real contentment with everything you did through your career?
I think I'm a bit like you, Cam. I tried to get out while I was still playing well and on top. And I mean, I remember seeing you at the end of your career holding the cup up, and you at the peak of your game. Yeah, you could have gone another year, maybe another two, but you went out as premiership captain, you're holding the cup up, and you've got out your reputation intact. And coming up to an age of 33, 34, I quietly made a decision to retire. My wife was sitting in the stands at the end of the Hickey stand with my son Levi. And unlike the fanfare that goes on now, I just quietly walked to the boundary line, pulled Levi over the fence, and Levi and I just walked off the ground on our own, and that was it. So could I go on another year longer? Well, I probably wish I could, because Malcolm Blight the next year, with a side that couldn't make the finals, were 1 minute from winning the premiership. And Paul Couch, who played a lot of that year in the reserves, and he was a good friend of mine, won the Brownlow medal. So, so you make strategic decisions, and that was it. I might have got stuck. Malcolm mightn't have wanted to play me. Politically, along the way, you make decisions, and you've got to wear them. I remember at the end of that time, they were looking. I was actually interviewed for the coaching job when Malcolm Blight got it, and this will rock people, but there were 3 people interviewed that I know of at that time. Malcolm Blight was interviewed. He was coaching West Torrens and had a good reputation over there. He was always going to get the job. Malcolm Blight was a great player, had experience coaching North Melbourne. I was interviewed. I think I put a good case forward, but I was coming off playing, and John Newman was interviewed for the job as well, which would surprise people. But John still had a good knowledge. Yep. He wouldn't have had a great rapport talking to players because he couldn't remember half their names, so that wouldn't have gone over all that well. But so the decision was made, and Malcolm got the job. I probably made a really bad strategic decision then. Ken Gannon sort of sounded me out at some stage, would you consider being assistant coach to Malcolm, which I really should have said yes to. If I could have got it, Malcolm Blight might have said, no, I don't want Mick Turner, he's gone for the coaching job and he's the next player, and move on sort of thing. But I probably should have made a good strategic decision then to be his assistant. But I took the turn, say, well, you wouldn't give me the job, I'll go and coach someone else. And I was working in Werribee at that time, went off and coached Werribee for a year in the VFA, which was in those times. And Werribee at that time was a Division 2 side coming into Division 1. So, politically, strategically, probably made, after I finished playing, some ordinary strategic decisions, mainly out of ego, I suppose, and bullheadedness.
Well, can I say, Mick, some of those decisions that you made then led to a lot of young men around this region, young footballers, being very, very thankful you made those decisions, because a few years down the track, you took over as regional manager of the Geelong Falcons. And I was going through some of the names, and I'm not going to be able to have the ability here to name them all, because there are massive, massive list of AFL players who've come through the Geelong Falcons. Your great mate, a good mate of mine, Brian Taylor, always in his commentary mentions the Geelong Falcons as a football factory. It's a bit of a throwaway line, but it is real, the numbers that have come through the Geelong Falcons. But some of those under your watch, Ablett Jr., Luke Hodge, Jimmy Bartell, Patrick Dangerfield, of course, Matty Scarlett, the great Jonathan Brown for the Brisbane Lions, currently Sam Walsh, Charlie Curnow, Tom Duday. I'm sure I've missed a whole heap of absolute stars there. Chris Heffernan played in the Essendon Premiership.
Cameron Ling.
Thank you, Mick. The influence and some of those philosophies that you discussed as you progressed through your football career, your captaincy philosophies, your modern thinking on the game, where you wanted to take your coaching, came out at the Geelong Falcons with some terrific coaches, Terry Bright and Brian Cordy and Buddha Hocking. Who else have I missed there? Damien Christensen. Some just outstanding coaches as well there. Your time at the Geelong Falcons and the influence that you're able to have on the next generation of AFL footballers.
Yeah, I was really fortunate that happened, because I was really frustrated at the end of my career, because a bit like you, when you play so long with your football club, my biggest thing is I wanted to work for the Geelong Football Club. And as I said, I went for the coaching job when Malcolm Blight got it, fair enough. I went for the coaching job when Gary Ayres got it, and I thought I put a good case then, but Gary Ayres was assistant coach to Malcolm Blight and was always going to be anointed. Then when he got the job, I went for the football operations manager's job, and I still remember having a meeting with Gary down at Rex Gorell's offices, and we spoke about him being coach and me football operations manager. But do you want someone who's gone for the coaching job as your football operations manager? So there may have been a bit of mistrust there. And then another time when Gary Davidson got the job, and that's all good, Gary Davidson, I was approached then, and then when they did the Mark Thompson review, I was approached then. So I missed quite a few opportunities, and look, those decisions are made. You're entitled to employ who you want to, but it became quite frustrating for me, wanting to get back to the Geelong Football Club, who my father played for and I played for, and you do love, you know that, it's your one club. So that was frustrating, but the good thing that came out of it, and thanks to Ken Gannon, I was able to, when Paul Armstrong got the job as football operations manager here, he moved from the Geelong Falcons into the Geelong Football Club, and his job became vacant. So look, I was mucking around a bit in that period. I was working, I coached Werribee for a year, I coached the Geelong District Football League side, Interleague side for a couple of years, the Ballerine. I'd been doing some work as a director of the Barnett's Footy Club, working in the media for Kay Rock and writing for the Geelong Addy, and I was actually a player manager for Barry Stone and Billy Brown, Sean Simpson and Robert Scott. So I had a lot of experience at a lot of things. So, but then when that job came up, I was fortunate enough to get it, and Ken Gannon gave me the job. And look, it was really hard going when we started, but look, it developed into a really good organisation, and with the system and that. And look, we were able to produce. We had a lot of great coaches, a lot of great staff, and certainly produced a lot of great players. So look, I'm not going to sit here and say that Michael Turner is the person that made the football factory what it is, and it is the football factory. It is the most successful AFL development program in Australia on all statistics. And you just got to look at AFL captains. When Sam Walsh is appointed, which he will be captain of, and there will be others, captain of the Carlton Footy Club, that's 9 AFL captains, Cameron, including yourself. So it's a massive list of talent, and but it's not only the talent that goes into the AFL. You produce talent that goes into the VFL, and you produce talent that goes into local football. Let's not forget that, whether it's St Joseph's or St Mary's over here, or whoever's playing. The players can only play to their ability, and St Mary's a couple of years ago played Colac in the grand final, and I counted there were on the list of 40 odd players that have played that day, there were 30 blokes that have been through the Falcons program, including Jack Blood and Harry Benson and all those sorts of players. They're all been fantastic players. So you can only achieve what you can achieve. But look, it filled a big gap in my career, and it was able to do that for 25 years. And look, it was a part-time program run by part-time staff because the players were part-time because they were going to school. But it was still run on, particularly towards the end, it was still run exactly the same within reason as an AFL club was. I was the CEO. We had a football operations manager department. We had a coaching department. We had a high performance department, medical department. That we had the girls program came in, the under 16s, which was their development program, a welfare as well, recruiting. It was all set up in 10 different departments, and I had department heads, and they conversed with me, and we got things run really well. So it was like a mini AFL club, and before COVID hit, we had 55 staff working for us on a part-time capacity, doing, let's say Geelong have got 55 staff. The difference, and I used to ask players all the time, like James Warper when he went to Hawthorn, I'd say to him, or any player that left, or Tanner Bruin, what's the difference between being at the Falcons and going to an AFL club? And they said, look, an AFL club's obviously got better facilities, full-time staff, it's fully professional, but the things we learn are exactly the same as at the Falcons, it's just the Falcons is part-time. But our staff did an unbelievable job at preparing players to get ready to play whatever level football they're going to play.
That's what I was going to jump in with there, Mick, that you talk to the modern players and recently retired players, even if I go back to my time, that program prepared players to be ready for AFL football. The step is still massive from under 18s to senior AFL football, but it feels like it's not as massive having been through that program. Am I allowed to test you on? You're not allowed to answer on the best player who went on with their AFL career, but just at their time at the Falcons. Who? I think I might know who it might be, but who was the best at the Falcons?
Well, he was pretty undisciplined, but he was the most talented. You know what I'm going to say? It was Luke Hodge, and that was only because Luke Hodge came to us as a 16-year-old and played in a premiership as a 16-year-old, and this is the old days when we played on the MCG before Eston won the premiership that year. So we get to play on the MCG in 2000. We had a good side, but most of our talent was under 17. We had a really good under 17 group, but Luke Hodge was playing that time as a 16-year-old and kicking goals over his head and doing all sorts of things. So that set him up for the draft the next year as a 17-year-old. But look, I'm not going to sit here and say that he's the best player after the Falcons, in AFL, because we had so many great players. But at that time, certainly the most talented player I'd ever seen. But certainly also, he had a bit of colic in him. He was bloody hard to manage. I tore strips off him many times in the property steward's room. And you'd probably in these days you'd be up for bullying these days, because we used to test him out a bit, but it was a different era.
You were also harder, I've found, on the more talented kids. You knew what they could become and what they would potentially be throwing away if they didn't get on the right track, which I always appreciated, that you believed in them, but they might have needed a nudge in the right direction. Yeah,
I think the most talented players, most of the players are playing up to their ability. The most talented players, I think you've got to test them. In those days, they were tested for a couple of reasons, because I wanted to test them and see what mantle they had, not only physically but mentally, whether they could handle a spray. Because when they were drafted, they'd go off and they're going to be coached by Alistair Clarkson or Mick Malthouse in the day, or Robert Walls, whoever it was going to be. Malcolm Blythe, whoever it was, they're going to test them. You know what I mean? So it was a different era, and mentally you were certainly going to be tested. So I used to test them a bit and demand a fair bit out of them, and also for the reason that you didn't want them to miss their opportunity. With the draft and everything. So look, many times towards the end I got a bit smarter. We'd always interview players with our football operations manager, our coach and myself, and I'd lead the discussion. And it was quite funny sometimes, because we might get Devon Smith in, for example, who played at Essendon, is now out at Lara, and Devon could be a bit wayward at times. I'm not saying Devon did this, but look, we also search social media. What are you doing on social media? What are you doing at school? What are you doing at your club? What are you doing at your friends? Because people would ring at us and tell us. And we'd have similar conversations that go on at AFL clubs now. If you want to get drafted and you want to keep playing for the Falcons, you've got to change your behaviour. You've got to change your friends. You've got to change what you're doing. You've got to change what you're doing on social media. People have got to forget these things. If you want to make it, you've got to change your behaviour and smarten up. So those conversations were definitely had, and you would sort of look back on those and say, well, was I bullying at that time? Well, in the current age of wokeness, I probably was a little bit. But I'd also say to my coach and my footy operations manager, how did that discussion go? And they'd often say, yeah, the discussion really went well, Mick. It's just the way you said it. You know what I mean? Because I could go hard. Yeah. But I don't think any of those discussions went backwards. I think all the players we had them with went forward, and they were done. And this is very important, Cameron. They were done in their best intentions, because it was a bit of a different era. And as things progressed, even from your time at the Falcons to what it ended up at the end, when technology came in and all our games were being taped, and like Geelong, they could watch their vision on the computer, and you had all the champion data stats, and we could analyse everything. The way that players were prepared and the information that they were given, and by our high performance staffs and dietitians and all that sort of stuff, became really to a very, very high level. So the last 8 years when I was running the Falcons, because we had such great staff, things were just humming along beautifully, and players were getting a great amount of information.
You did an incredible job, Mick. Thank you for everything you did for my career too. Quite seriously. The modern team, do you get to watch much of this current team? And who, out of all of those guys running around, and perhaps in last year's grand final, but so far this season, who catches your eye? Who do you just love to watch?
Well, most of them actually, because they've got such a good side. And look, I must categorically say, it's been astounding that Geelong's been able to maintain their success for 20 years, because, the average footy supporter, I don't think, realises how hard that is to do. And, that starts at the top with your board and your management, whether it be Brian Cook or, Stephen, Hocking, or your management team, Simon Lloyd, your coaches, Chris Scott, and who's been here. So it's a very, very, very hard thing to manage. So, Geelong have managed it extremely well. I've always had a bit of a theory the last few years that they are starting to get a bit old, but they've been able to manage that. Certainly you've got to give credit to the training and the high performance and the medical staff, because they've been able to keep youth on the players' side, even though some players, normally when you get into your 30s, as you know, you lose that 10%, that 20%, but the high performance staff, the coaching and the medical staff seem to have been able to energise and keep their older players young, like Blitzars and all those players, even Joel Selwood last year. So they've got a lot of longevity onto their players. So it's always worried me that they've got, when you look through their list, 8 of their probably best players at certain times are well into their 30s. So, they're going to come to an abrupt end at some stage. But in saying that, though, through the trade and also back to the draft again, they've been able to reinvigorate our list. And I looked this year quite extraordinary. And my last year at the Falcons, the two super talented players we had was Ollie Henry, who I rated #1. I couldn't believe Collingwood let him go, to tell you the truth. It's just quite outstanding. And Tanner Bruin, who was at Grammar, didn't play a lot of games because of a few injuries. And I'm not saying he's Joel Selwood, but he's Joel Selwood-like. For him to come back from GWS, and I'm sure they're sorry they lost him, and Ollie Henry to get away from Collingwood after 2 years and end up back at Geelong is quite extraordinary. And and Geelong have made, there's no doubt Geelong have made a concerted recruiting effort over the last few years because of the trade and free agency. They've brought a lot of Falcons players back that have been drafted to other clubs, whether it's Luke Dalhouse or Paddy Dangerfield or Gary Rowan, Tanner Bruin, Ollie Henry. If you go through it, I think on the side on the weekend there were 9 or 10 ex-Falcons players playing, which is a lot, isn't it? So they've. I'm not saying they've learnt, but Stephen Wells is a smart operator. They've been able to use the system that's allowed to them through the draft, through trade, and bringing back people to Geelong, because Geelong's a good place to live, obviously. Bringing those players back into the club to reinvigorate their side, and they've just got massive talent in their side. So they're in as good a situation now. I know they lost the first 3 games, but they're in as good a situation now as ever, to win another premiership. There's no doubt about that.
I've got to ask you about the young bloke who wears #9 now, Maxie Holmes. He looks something special. Are your eyes often drawn to who's wearing the 9 and being extra proud of the performances of some of those special #9s post your career?
Well, Kelly was a good #9. He was a very good player. Off the back flank in all those premiership years, a good player. And Holmes is he's got some special attributes about him. I don't come to the football that much, but I will come to a couple of games soon because my grandchildren are growing up. I've got a grandson, Raf, who's only 3, but he wears #9 when he comes to the footy. He was here on the weekend with Ziggy, my other son. He wears #9, and Levi, my son, my oldest son, he brings them to the footy. So in the not too distant future, I'll bring both those boys to the football, and they'll be wearing their #9s. I won't wear mine, because the jumper's a bit tatty now, but we'll be watching, and you get a glimpse of it. What takes my eye, especially, Cam, and it's when I watch the football, I've got a special eye for the football. I like to watch it emerge, and the game's at a good stage at the moment because it's a very attacking game. The forward handball's changed, it hasn't it? Like forward handball run attacking the way Collingwood play and Geelong play. It's an exciting brand of football, but my eyes are always drawn to the ex-Falcons players, whether it's Jack Stephen playing at St Kilda, or Gary Rowan when he was at Sydney, or you playing at Geelong. My eyes are drawn to the ex-Falcons players and how they're going and how they're developing. So I'm always sort of drawn to that because that was a 25-year stint, and with COVID, 26 years. And you're interested in those boys because you get to know them over that 3-year period when you've got them as a 16-year-old, 17, 18-year-old, and maybe even a 19-year-old of how they're developing. So that's what tends to take me high, and that's not taking anything away from Holmes because it's a #9. He's a pretty special player.
Yeah, I think he might have a very good career, Mick. Thank you so much for joining us to tell your story, a story that we love hearing, and celebrating a career that I'm sure a lot of people loved watching. It's great to see you too. Yeah, no, it's good, mate, and all the best to the club in the future, mate. I take a close eye, and proud to be a one club player, and what we've achieved, and we go from here. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Mick. Big thanks to McCafe for allowing us to bring this to you. If you've enjoyed this member exclusive experience, please check out the other ones we've got. We're talking to some of the absolute greats of the Geelong Football Club as part of this, the Legends of Kardinia Park.